for the warm welcome, and thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. I wish I was sitting in a nice villa by a pool in France or Spain or Italy for that matter, but I'm in my front room, and I'm here today with our CEO, Ari Paparo. And Ari, I have to do a little brief introduction for you, which I'm sure you can sit through, but for people who don't already know Ari, Ari is the CEO of Beeswax. Prior to Beeswax, Ari has held a number of product leadership positions across the ad tech and marketing tech sectors. Most recently at Bazaar Voice, a publicly traded SaaS company that enables retailers and brands to better connect to their consumers through ratings, reviews, and photos, another UGC. Before that, he was the director of product management at Google's DoubleClick business and the head of product management for AppNexus. Ari is pretty well known in the online advertising community for his authorship of the vast specification for online video and his development of the GRP model for Nielsen. He's a frequent contributor to AdExchanger, Business Insider, and other industry publications, as well as a speaker at advertising industry conferences. And finally, an excellent Twitter follow. so Ari, if we can go from here, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for that ridiculous intro. It's kind of hard to hear talked about. I feel pretty honored because you and I talk together all the time, Cadi, but you two, we've never been on a panel together, I don't think, because you don't usually have two people from the same company, and you're the panel queen. You literally are ubiquitous in the panel team. So I'm really looking forward to
I moderated you on a beach last year in Cannes, so maybe this villa setup is reminiscent of.
Oh yeah. Cannes. I remember Cannes. This has nothing to do with Cannes.
Nothing to do with
approximately the same time of year, but absolutely, this is a summer advertising festival that we're having virtually, unrelated to anything related to the south of France or any sort of big predatory.
I'm even drinking
mammal. I have no rosé. I'm not poolside. I'm in a garden area, so it couldn't be more different.
Indeed. What might be similar is that we'll be having some great ad tech chat this afternoon. I'm really keen to start us off with talking a little bit about the wider sort of macro environment. I think many sections of our industry, marketing communications, have been really heavily impacted by the global pandemic. At Beeswax, we're now in the fortunate position where we've seen a return to sort of pre-COVID spend by our customers. But I'm really interested in your views on what the longer term impact of the pandemic might be on our sector as you see it currently.
Yeah, sure. I think that the relationship between global advertising and GDP is pretty stable over a short amount of time. I think the analyst Benedict Evans, who's very well known, recently published an article on this that was very instructive, showing that it was pretty stable over 5 and 10 year periods. So the impact of COVID sort of has two immediate effects. The first one, which I think we all felt, was that industries that were hit by COVID hard, like travel and brick and mortar retail, had a sharp and significant decline in ad spend. That was, think of it as like an economic shock to the system. And that a lot of that spend has not come back. And if you are in that sector, you're probably not spending much. If you're a vendor that specializes in that sector, it's pretty painful. And we even have seen some analysts talk about how Google, who seems like an unstoppable force in advertising, may have a down quarter or may have some bad results because they have so much travel advertising. So that is what it is, like basically this vertical effect. Secondary effect is the implication that if global GDP is flat, declining, or struggling for the reasons of the effect of the pandemic, then you would expect overall advertising to be soft for a longer period of time, not as a shock immediately down 100%, but maybe slightly down and trending to be flat over a more extended period of time. So that's interesting. And I think that, I think we all hope that the global economy will really come back at the end of this year, but it's very difficult to predict. And then the third, I think the most interesting question is whether the media mix and the types of advertising change. We've seen some interesting disruptions to advertising as a result of COVID, like, for example, the lack of sports, which is a major driver of linear television advertising, it's been a big factor reducing the availability of advertising, but also things like outdoor billboards, which have been a very fast-growing digital out-of-home, fast-growing area of spend, which has been hurt pretty significantly by the lack of mobility of the population. And some of those trends, and this also, just to also check Benedict Evans one more time, he makes a point in this article he brought out a couple weeks ago that the .com boom really accelerated the decline of newspaper advertising in a way that wasn't entirely obvious, because basically advertisers went away, it didn't come back. And it could be interesting to see if there are similar unpredictable effects where, for example, linear TV, which has been on a long plateau over the past 5 or 10 years, might get hit pretty hard. It might not come back as well as people think, especially if there's no significant sports for another 6 months.
I mean, there's definitely a huge amount of uncertainty out there. I think outside of the big sort of macroeconomic situation, there are some pretty specific, significant changes happening in the space. I'm thinking about the cookie apocalypse and the sort of challenges that we're seeing to identity. I think the changes that Apple announced 10 days ago or so now around mobile device IDs is going to be further disruption in that space. Could you take us through a little bit more on sort of how Beeswax is approaching that for our customers, and maybe how other players in the programmatic space, both on the buy and sell side, are thinking about it?
Yeah, I think that starting with the Chrome announcement in January, I think it was a wake-up call to the industry that we really needed to finally move beyond the cookie. It was a boiling frog problem where it took for 5 years or even 10 years. Anyone who was thinking about the problem realized that third-party cookies were going away, were not reliable, were an antiquated technology, and yet we weren't doing anything about it. And even when 30 or 40% of the market was unaddressable in Safari through ITP, we still weren't doing anything about it. And advertisers were sort of ignoring the problem, despite the fact that Apple iOS users are generally higher income, higher value consumers. So the Chrome announcement shocked us out of that complacency to some extent and made us, as an industry, more aggressively look at solutions using other methods. And this was already going on, but it really put the attention on either startups or bigger companies that were investing in this area. And a lot's happened over the last 6 months, where different solutions out there have become, I would say, more production ready and have started to get some progress out there. Beeswax, we partnered with LiveRamp for their IDL solution, which is a sort of a hashed personal email, hashed personal data approach to identity. It's not the only approach out there. There are other vendors who also have ID sort of schemes for doing things. There are other vendors who are trying to allow optimization and targeting to work on first-party publisher data, which is much less likely to be blocked or interrupted by the browsers. And so all that's been the last 6 months. And then the Apple's announcement last week potentially bridges the problems, the Chrome problem, into the app world, which is a huge and growing portion of the advertising ecosystem. And there's a different set of potential solutions there, different set of opportunities there that are still kind of a little bit unknown, because I think there's still a bunch of questions around the effectiveness of those solutions in the app environment. So it's basically a little bit of a chaotic situation. I would say that we're out of the boiling frog mode, but we're still in the pot, right? No one's made the leap out of the pot. And I don't see personally, maybe other people do, but I don't see advertisers or their agencies putting out RFPs for, cookieless DSPs just yet. It's too early, or maybe it's too late. I'm not even sure. It's such a confusing situation. Katie, I'll turn it back to you. Have you seen any advertisers say, I'm looking for a cookieless DSP?
I do know of one who's RFPing for identity solutions, which kind of is a halfway step there.
Halfway step, right? So I think it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to move on to a more sustainable, privacy-centric way of delivering personalized advertising and measurable advertising. But the world's, no matter how you slice it, the world's not going to be better from an ROI perspective than it was in the cookie world. It will not. I think that we should expect the value of digital advertising to have some headwinds because of this stuff. Because in the past things were easy and measurable. In the future they may be difficult and less measurable. And it's hard to imagine a world where it accelerates the use of digital techniques. I think it is a headwind, and we should acknowledge that.
But do you think digital is perhaps judged more harshly, though, on the basis because all of this stuff has historically been possible?
Yeah, I think it is, absolutely. I mean, if digital is still, even in the cookie environment, vastly more measurable and accountable than, say, linear TV. I think there's a bias among the media buyers and the marketers towards simplicity. And so in an environment where you can measure something sort of the same way you've measured it for 50 years and it's consistent, that has a big positive association with it, even if it's not as good or as granular as some other method. And I think there's a lot of dynamics about digital that work against it. Like in digital, anyone can create a website and put ads on it, and that's a great thing for democracy and for speech and for points of view, but it's a bad thing for the credibility of advertising, because you end up with these long tail websites that aren't very accountable and aren't very professional when it comes to ad load and viewability, etc. So it's a very difficult situation. I've been in digital advertising for almost 15 years, and before that I had a startup, and like the same dynamics been going on since the late 90s. And it's kind of hard to square the circle on, digital has all this promise, all this measurability, all of this, accountability, but also it's messy and chaotic and there's fraud and other stuff. And it doesn't seem like the two can be reconciled unless you centralize and everyone just buys all their ads from Facebook and forgets about the digital world. And no one wants that.
Dude, that's actually a really nice segue to the thing I was going to ask you to speak to a little bit next is really, in that world of things that digital gets dinged for, right? Recently in the UK, there was a big report released by IDFA into the programmatic supply chain. And we're increasingly hearing from brands and media companies who want to sort of take back control. What sort of advice would you offer to a brand who's currently reevaluating their partners?
Yeah, I think that there are different levels of control that are, from a brand's perspective, there are very different levels of control. And some of them are kind of easy and some of them are quite difficult. And they often get all conflated together. And I think agencies have a role in conflating things because they want to look smart, they want to give value to their customers. And if the agency doesn't come to the marketer and say, oh, what do you want? Easy, no problem. That doesn't really work in their interest. So I've spoken to marketers who literally don't know where they're buying ads, right? And that's unacceptable in today's day and age. The ability to see a included list, we're not supposed to call them white lists anymore, so we'll start with a new terminology, an included and excluded list, the ability to understand deal IDs and how they're being negotiated, and where you're buying the ads. That is easy, and if it's not easy, I think someone's up to something. And so that's kind of, your first pass. Where am I buying ads? Who am I buying them from? This is not a difficult problem to answer. But then you get to the next level starts getting increasingly difficult, and you might say, first of all, sure, I'm buying this site, the FT, let's say, but where am I getting it from? Who are the intermediaries involved in that transaction? And now the complexity is increased, and the simple answer of what exchange is coming on might only give you half the story. And this is where things like getting access to sellers.json, ads.text, the related technologies can be a lot more complicated. And I think that's where agencies are investing. I've spoken to many agencies who are starting to invest in sort of data warehouses around putting all that data together, but also asking your DSP for the raw logs so you can understand what seller IDs, publisher IDs, placement IDs are correlated with the sites you may be buying. And then the third level, and probably the hardest level, is what the ISBA report was getting at, which is where is the money flowing? Not just who the parties are, but how they're providing the media that you're buying. And this is where you may need log files, not just from your provider, but from the providers that they're buying from, the exchanges, publishers, et cetera. And that's an order of magnitude more difficult. In some cases, the exchange may not provide them, or may provide them with redacted data, or you may run into all kinds of other kind of issues. And so I think that the ISBA report was great for kind of showing that. I think a lot of the press coverage of the ISBA report, or the Twitter coverage, was a bit hysterical and overly excitable about the mysterious missing 15%. Oh my God, you know, right? This is, yeah, it's kind of complicated to make it all work, but I think that the reality is that you're buying ads from a complex ecosystem of supply vendors, and they take a cut. Like, they're for-profit businesses, so of course they take a cut. So in sum, I would say there's not one answer on transparency. Marketers should be asking their agencies and partners for different levels of transparency. And, you know, if you really want to get the answers, you really need to look into the log files. So you should only really work with a vendor or a set of vendors that are transparent with their log files.
No, that's super helpful. We've actually, just a brief plug, but we've actually got a panel at this exact same time tomorrow with brands from Nestle, from L'Oreal, and a few other places who are going to share their views on what brands really think about the future of programmatic. So I'll be asking them the same question, and interesting to see see if they're also following that same three-stage route.
How many panels are you on this week, Katie?
Just 4. You know, super casual. How are you getting trolled away? So, actually thinking about log files and log level data being sort of super important in terms of transparency. We're also seeing them being used for optimization, right? Most DSPs have some kind of level of custom optimization capabilities nowadays. And I think that sort of rise in automation seems to really being driving a lot more sort of innovation in media trading. I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of where it goes from here. You know, with some traders perhaps struggling to get access to the data they need, whether that's sort of skill set or platforms' willingness to share, or simply just the cost of processing data. Kind of, are we at risk of a kind of a two-tier ecosystem with sort of simple trading and then sort of custom opt? What do you?
Yeah, it's a big topic. I mean, I think that I often talk to people who are not from this business, or from from a big tech company interested in ad tech, and their first assumption is always that the progress of bringing machine learning to ad tech should remove the need for people. That's the assumption of someone from the outside world coming into the space, and it's interesting because that largely has not happened. As I think we all know, ad ops has become a very specialized skill. And traders and their ad ops counterparts on the publisher side are key parts of the ecosystem. And I think it's pretty clear that, except for the most simplistic KPIs, they do a vital job to making this world work. So you kind of have to ask yourself why, and why haven't they been eliminated? And I think the answer is that despite the fact that some of the best minds in the world work on these problems, the problem of optimizing an advertiser's KPI sort of an automated basis is very difficult because there's so much variability in the environments in which the ads can show. They're effectively like too many signals in terms of the user, the environment, the time, the offer, the creative, etc. And so when you're in an open system like programmatic, where it all varies all the time, sort of like the stock market or whatever, and there's that many variables and relatively small budgets, so in the thousands of dollars a day, not in the millions of dollars a day, the algorithmic approach tends not to work. And where it tends to work are in two different areas. One is in closed systems. So inside Facebook, where they know every piece of inventory, every creative, and they're competing against each other, they can make those decisions about which creative is better on behalf of the advertiser. So it's a closed system. In the rest of the world, the open system, that doesn't work. The second way it works is if it's a very simplistic KPI, like click-through rate. An algorithm can get better click-through rate than a person generally. So when you get to so we're in this world where it's very complicated. The KPIs are subtle. So you know, you may say, well, I just want online installs. Okay, that's an easy KPI, but it's not really, because once you take into account fraud, lifetime value of the customer, return on ad spend over 7 days, 14 days, the algorithms start breaking down and really can't do nearly as good a job at learning quickly and for limited budget as some combination of people, custom algorithms, and some built-in machine learning. So that's a long answer as to why custom algorithms really matter. How do you build a custom algorithm? Well, you need a couple things. First of all, you need to have a pretty good data pipeline, so that data about whether you're actually hitting your KPI or not is coming back to the system and to the people, and that's often a challenge. Many big companies, we hear like, oh yeah, we have data in the silo, or we know what we want, but we really can't measure it, stuff like that, or we don't want to share that data with the vendors. Another interesting nuance. Like, we know what really matters, but there's no way I'm going to give even my agency that data. So that's the first thing, getting that data back. The second is that the platform actually needs to have the ability to let a relatively less skilled person, meaning not engineering, not C++ writing, to move the algorithm around. So that could be as simple as bid modifiers, or as complex as multivariate models, or something else in between. And then the third thing is that you need some raw data on which to project your KPIs. So if the only data you're getting is, you know, the impressions you won over the last 7 days and how many conversions you got, you can optimize that, but you're optimizing within a very narrow amount of data. Basically, it's the data you already have about what you already won. And if you optimize it too much, you're just going to win more of what you already won. And then you're going to have problems of reach and budget. What you need to have is the frame set of, first, here's what I won and what it was worth. And then second, here's what I can apply it to. Here's the either bid logs or auction logs or otherwise the landscape of what's available, so that I can understand where I can optimize that's not entirely, you know, local optima, that's just a little bit more of what I already have. So so that's kind of my thinking around this custom algorithm problem. To summarize, it's important. It's the key way to get KPIs. And in order to get it, you need to have access to your own data as well as the general auction data.
And can everyone do it? Should everyone?
To some extent. I mean, not everyone. You know, if you look at, like, say, the walled gardens, Google and Facebook, they have literally, you know, hundreds of thousands of active advertisers, and probably 80–90% of them don't advertise anywhere besides the walled gardens, and probably shouldn't, right? So your budget of $5,000 a month for a product that you sell out of your garage, probably not, you know, not time for a custom algorithm. But as you go up the scale and you start either in-housing your programmatic or have an agency that's very hands-on, I'd say that in most cases you'll get better results if you move the dials around than if you sort of set it and forget it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We second plug. The panel at this time on Wednesday is going to focus on the next generation of media trading. So we've got some experts from Jellyfish, from MIQ, from the programmatic company, and from Xaxis, all joining us to discuss some of the techniques their traders are using to get great results for their customers.
I'm feeling like I thought I was the CEO of this company. I thought I got the good slot. Now I found out I'm on a Monday.
You got that. You're opening the week for us. Yeah, setting the tone.
Yeah. Okay.
So actually, I want to come back to something you talked a little bit about at the beginning of a conversation today. So through the lockdown period of the pandemic, we've seen certain sectors really accelerate. In-app, audio, esports, in-game advertising, just a few examples of the kind of industry that have really taken off. I mean, in advertising, there's quite often a lag between sort of where users are and where then the advertising dollars are. Like, which sections of the industry do you think will continue to see growth in over the next couple of years?
Well, I think in the US, the hottest topic for the past 2 years has been connected TV, and probably will continue to be. It's much less so outside the US, but in the US, it's absolutely the fastest growing, most exciting part of the market, as consumers have moved away from the traditional linear cable bundle, and advertising has followed through Roku and Zoomy and Fubi and all these other companies that offer consumers that experience. So that's the first thing. And I think in Europe, there will be some of this. It's a little less of a pronounced effect because of, per country.
We had fewer cords to cut.
Yeah, fewer cords, more of an oligopoly. So otherwise, I would have said digital out of home, which was before COVID. And so I think they're going to have a bad year no matter what. Audio is super interesting. So we're seeing programmatic audio become more popular as a way of advertising, as well as the growth of ad-supported podcasts, which has been growing enormously on the consumer level. I think they're very different. Programmatic audio is a great sort of open area where the sort of techniques that Beeswax or other DSPs offer are very appropriate, as long as you can get the creative working. Whereas podcast is much more of a closed ecosystem. It's not nearly as trackable, and is increasingly looking like it's going to be a duopoly between Spotify and Apple. So those are kind of top level. What I would say in general, it is more of a prediction sort of thing, is that if identity becomes more challenging, which I think we all expect it to, creative will become more important. I think in general, the smart money has always been that creative is underestimated. People always spend all their time on targeting and attribution and things like that, when the creative actually is what gets the consumer's attention. I think when you start stripping away the ability to finely tune who you're targeting to, and you're doing more, say, programmatic guaranteed, and more site buys, and more attribution that only tells you what site it's on, like the new Apple attribution spec, you're going to want that creative to be really exciting. And so I'd see rewarded video and interstitial video in the in-app space as being very important. I think you'll see bigger ads on the web display space, with more offers inside the ad and potentially clickable areas inside the ad as becoming more important, and a lot less of banners whose main focus was collecting a cookie for attribution. You'll see a lot less of that.
Yay, down with cookie bombing.
No cookie bombing. More big, complicated creatives.
Well, so off the back of that, so tomorrow at 2 p.m. UK time, we have a panel on the future of in-game advertising, just to talk about that, which is another interesting environment. Ari, I have one more question for you, but I want to make sure that everyone listening, I can see we've already got some questions coming in through the Q&A, so we will open to questions from the audience in just a minute. But I'd love to know, and I know the people on the call would love to hear from you around what the future holds for Beeswax.
For Beeswax. That's my day job. I think that we're continuing on our mission to give the sophisticated advertisers tools to enable them to take control of their programmatic advertising. I think that the challenges that we've been discussing in this call around identity control becomes really important, because there's this black box in between you and your results, and it's going to be hard to diagnose what's in the black box when you don't have cookies, you don't have IDFAs. And I think that the smart marketers are going to want to open the box, see what's inside, potentially do different manipulations of the data. And so they're going to need open, transparent platforms with a lot of control to get the results they need moving forward. And that's what we're really dedicated to.
I'm excited for it. Right, okay, so now come out of full screen mode. Oh, sorry, that's you if you really objected to the poolside picture. So
wait, am I in the poolside picture? Am I the guy with the red shirt or something? No.
Yeah, I guess so. So I have a question here. What will be the effect of the iOS opt-in IDFA rules on frequency capping and on the CPI advertising market? Are you okay to answer this one?
Yeah, I knew the IDFA question was coming in. I'm not going to answer that question. I'll answer a related question, which is here's what we don't know and don't know. So it's going to be opt-in. The user will be asked, could we use your data? The quick answer most people think is that most people will say no, but we don't really know if the apps will be allowed to nag you. You might have a situation where the app doesn't allow you to use their content unless you opt in. So that the quick reaction of it's going to be 10% opt-in rates is questionable. It could be 40 or 50% opt-in rates. And that's going to really determine the answer to some of these other questions. The second unknown is the extent to which apps are going to cheat or fingerprint. And whether Apple is really going to crack down on that. I know it's a dirty subject. No one likes fingerprinting. Everyone hates it. But will an app, for example, that sends the IP address of the user or some other data about the user in the bid request be slapped down by Apple, or will it be allowed? And that will have a big effect, for example, on fingerprinting, on frequency capping, which does not have to be precise. So if we, for example, get a hashed string of some data about the device in the bid request and could use it for frequency capping, then that will work. On CPI advertising, it is likely to have a negative effect no matter what. So CPI advertising will become much less precise. We'll have less data on what caused the user to install. We'll have less user data for things like retargeting. And so a lot of the managed service vendors that are currently out there, either ad networks or managed service DSPs, will have a lot less data to execute CPIs. So as a result, it'll become less effective. CPIs will go up. It's almost guaranteed that CPIs will go up. And then it'll be interesting to see what techniques continue to work versus those that stop working.
It's a tough few years ahead. Well, a few months, I guess. It's not even going to be years. That's true. I have quite a specific question here about the growth of programmatic digital out of home before COVID. And someone would like to know if Beeswax intends to support transacting programmatic out of home in future.
Yeah, so it was growing, like I said, before COVID. I don't know the exact number, but it was growing pretty well. We've always intended to, but it's not been on our roadmap. The main reason it's not been on our roadmap is because the techniques you use to buy and to measure are vastly different than the techniques you use in any of the other digital media. In out of home, you don't have a user. You have a sort of an average cohort of potential users. So it's almost like an audience rating around the location, and you don't have any conversion data. And so we felt that there wasn't enough value to our customers to justify us putting it in our platform. We felt that a customer could just as easily use a different platform and get just as much value. Whereas programmatic audio has all the commonalities that programmatic video or other things do.
We've got some really interesting questions coming up now, Ari. Are you able to share your thoughts on the Facebook boycott?
Yeah, I can, sure. I mean, I think that the overwhelming evidence is that Facebook is irresponsible in the management of their platform from a news and politics point of view. And I think that there's two ways to stop that. One is consumers to stop using the product, which doesn't seem to be happening. And two is for advertisers to stop advertising, which is great that some have stepped up to do that. I wonder if it will have enough of an effect to meaningfully change Facebook's approach, but at least it could make a little dent here and get them to start acting responsibly.
It's we live in interesting times, right? Like the Chinese proverb.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in contrast, you know, one of the things that's been interesting is that Twitter has acted much more responsibly around these issues, and yet they're lumped in many of these advertiser boycotts, and I don't think that's appropriate. I think Twitter should be commended for some of the things they've done, like banning political advertising, taking a stance on Trump's tweets, et cetera.
Interesting. I have a much more specific question around identity. Do you think the solutions that are trying to replace the cookie in situ, such as ID5, as opposed to more overtly, such as LiveRamp, in spite of the trends browsers have set, are they doomed to fail because the ship has sailed?
Okay.
I'm sure you can no comment if you need to.
I think that both, I wouldn't make as much of a distinction between those two approaches. I think that any approach that tries to send a signal from the browser to the buyers of media is vulnerable to further browser restrictions. And so it's a careful game because the browsers are effectively unelected regulators right now. Not just unelected like the EU regulators, but also unresponsive. They can do whatever they want. Apple can just ban the color yellow in browsers if they wanted to, right? So I think both, assuming that you're accepting the premise of the question that these two approaches are totally different and whatever, they're both vulnerable to the same problem. So will Apple go after them? I don't know. I think that there's a public relations issue with identity solutions, which is any reporter could write up the headline tomorrow, which is the Adtech people are defying the privacy regulations given to them by governments and big tech. What's going on? And they're like, did you know that when we slammed down on cookies, they started sending your email address to 4,000 different parties? We have a list of all the parties that the Financial Times sent your email to. And it's just like, how do you win that argument against these sort of nonsensical privacy hysteria headlines?
Interesting. So yeah. I think it's hard to explain the value exchange though, right? To the general public that actually, you know, advertising does fund the websites they like to spend time on.
And the privacy impact of a cookie is literally zero. But no one wants to hear that. I mean, the correct answer is that browsers need to be regulated.
So a sort of adjacent question here, will Google, and I'm assuming it's Android, follow the Apple decision on app with the Google advertising ID becoming opt-in?
I find it very unlikely that Google will at least quickly follow. I think Google it was forced to do Chrome cookies because they were, first of all, several years behind Safari, but secondly, the optics of the cookie are very bad. Like this idea that thousands of companies are tracking you in real time, is all like those sort of headlines were really kind of getting the Chrome team down. Whereas the identifier is a little more of a silent leak of data. And I think that they'll be able to resist doing anything for quite some time. But I could be wrong.
Assuming that no one puts that as their headline, the silent leak of data.
I think everyone in tech knows that. Yeah, the silent leak. I think everyone in tech knows that Android is a lot more loose around privacy data, and this is kind of the last thing on the list. There's a lot of other things they could do first to protect your privacy that have nothing to do with advertising.
I've got an interesting question here again in the same sort of identity space, but the question is, Many of our customers will be found on niche publications. Is there wiggle room in the third-party definition as it stands if we were to set up direct relationships and use their retargeting cookie, i.e. the audience becomes devices who have visited publication.com in the last 90 days?
Right, right. Well, I'm not in charge of the browser or the rules, so I'm a little bit probably the wrong person to ask. I know there's been quite a bit of discussion about how the ITP and Google Chrome announcements would affect syndicated logins, where you have multiple sites sharing a login. That already is and that's a very innocent use case and is a problematic environment where third-party cookies are not allowed. I think that under the current Chrome proposal, OAuth would stop working. So there's some real issues that need to be worked out. As to that second question, I think there was a really good discussion of that by, I think Paul Bannister wrote some things up about that from Cafe Mom, where he was saying there's, what's the difference between, let's say, Fox News and Fox Sports sharing a cookie, where those are two very different websites with very different. Oh, I think he gave a better example, which was Fox Sports and the Wall Street Journal. Like, there's no reason to believe those audiences know or care that they're owned by the same corporate entity, but they could share data, or they should be able to share data, versus a website of a web ad network of many, many small sites who also have the same ownership. And so those issues need to be worked out, hopefully to the benefit of those use cases. But right now, it's all bound.
The next question is really similar to this, but publisher consortia. Are publishers coming together key to competing against? Oh, lost my headphones. Competing with walled gardens in a cookieless world.
I think there's some real benefits to publishers consortia, especially in markets where the leading publishers have enormous reach, probably less so in the US, but more so in Europe. I think they solve a couple of problems. The targeting problem gets helped a lot. So if you're in an environment without third-party cookies and you've got a bunch of publishers who all agree on a taxonomy of user data, and deal IDs, and maybe even shared user IDs for frequency capping, that could give the advertiser a lot of tools they don't have if you have to buy each publisher separately. Also, programmatic guaranteed could be another thing there. It doesn't solve all the problems, though. It doesn't solve attribution very well, because even if you have all the big publishers, you can't really tell what happened on the advertiser website. And if you're interested in this topic, I wrote a white paper on all the pluses and minuses of various identity options, and that's available on the Beeswax website.
We'll see if we can share the link in the chat here.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't have the link. Maybe Paul can enter it, but that has a pretty in-depth discussion of this issue.
Thank you. So this one's much more interesting in terms of location. But so post-COVID, brands are trying to get people back to stores. Most of them have gone online. How do you see drive to store as an attribution model amid COVID, IFA, cookie apocalypse? The list goes on.
Yeah. Drive to store is a great idea. I think that the ability for vendors to measure drive to store has already declined massively in the past year or two, since Apple put up its warning, this app is using your location data warning. The Wall Street Journal reported that 70% reduction in geolocation since that happened. So drive to store has already has declined enormously in terms of its accuracy. And now in the Apple iOS 14, they're giving consumers the option to be less specific about their location. So whereas previously you would allow an app to get your location, it would be precise latitude and longitude, you now have an option to make it within a couple of kilometers, which makes a lot of sense for like a weather app. The weather app doesn't need to know where I am exactly, it needs to know what neighborhood I'm in or what city I'm in. So that will further decline the precision of the data for this use case. Plus IDFA, now we'll have some users who we know exactly where they are, but we have no idea who they are. So it'll become even more complicated. So I think that it's very challenging to do drive to store generic generic attribution. What's more likely is that you'll have sort of panel-based, where you have some opt-in consumers who give full access for a benefit of some kind. It could just be the app from that store. If you're a Walmart customer and you opt in to full tracking for Walmart and you get like a discount, that makes a lot of sense. I think generically using the bid log data for that is already problematic. It's only going to get harder.
Mm. Controversial one for you next. You got in a little bit of trouble for this previously, so I know. Do these iOS updates reinforce your opinion about the demise of DMPs?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so my point, I had said on Twitter at some point, I say everything on Twitter, hopefully not after too many cocktails, but so at some point I had mentioned that DMPs were dead, which I thought was common conventional wisdom because they are dead, right? But apparently some DMP employees were not happy about that, and I had to say, hey, don't listen to what I say on Twitter, just listen to what Katie says. She's nicer than me. So let me clarify. DMPs
this is your opportunity.
Dead.
Make it good.
They're really, really dead. Dead. If you have a DMP, turn it off. It's not adding value.
You're going to be in so much trouble.
But I'll be more precise about this, which is there's still a role for sell-side DMPs. So if you're a publisher and you want a DMP to organize your first-party data and then make it available as segments and targeting, that makes total sense. Keep doing that because first-party data still works. And as a publisher, especially if you're at scale, having an understanding of your data is really important. So I'm a big fan of publisher DMPs. Keep doing it. Buy-side DMPs, entirely cookie-based, useless, no point to them. I'm sorry you signed a 3-year contract 2 years ago. Just wait it out, get out of that thing, and move on.
Brilliant. Ari,
was that non-controversial for you?
I think I'm still going to have people emailing me to complain.
Okay, good.
So Ari, thank you so much for sharing today. I think you've covered, you've given us a lot of context that's going to really help us as we move through the series of panels over the next few days as part of this, what am I supposed to call it? It's definitely not Cannes, the virtual summer Adtech summit. Is that right?
Festival. I thought they were using the word festival.
Maybe it's festival.
Festival.
No, maybe festival's the one we're not supposed to use, I think.
Okay, right. Carnival.
Maybe.
Carnival or Adtech.
There we go. So thank you for setting the scene for us and what we have in store for people over the next few days. All of the panels that we're hosting can be found via the Beeswax website. But I'd like to thank everyone who joined for their questions, and thank Ari again just for providing such insights today. Thank you.
Thanks all for having us.